Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Hello and Yali Madid. My name is Muniza Ahmed, and I will be the moderator for today's critical conversation. The Critical Conversation series has been conceived as an ITREB USA initiative aimed at engaging the entire Jamaat, but with the focus on 18 to 40-year-olds. The series aims to explore the critical questions of our time within the context of our faith. Before we begin, in the spirit of justice, I would like to read a land acknowledgement. Land acknowledgements are formal statements that seek to recognize and respect Indigenous peoples as original stewards of their lands and the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. We do this to express gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory we reside on, and to honor the Indigenous people who have been living on and caring for these lands from time immemorial. Recognizing them also means acknowledging the historical and ongoing genocide of Indigenous peoples and the ways in which we benefit from and perpetuate violence towards Indigenous peoples. Naming the original and current stewards of the land we live on is a first step towards making reparations. I reside in Plymouth, Minnesota. Today, the state of Minnesota shares geography with 11 tribal nations, in addition to the Dakota, Ho-Chunk, Cheyenne, Oto, Iowa, Hidatsa, Arikara, Aninin, Cree, Blackfeet, Assiniboine, and the Sac and Fox tribes, all who acknowledge Minnesota as important through their tribal histories. We believe the work we do in sessions like these is part of our responsibility to acknowledge and address the ongoing harm to Indigenous peoples and work towards a society that is more just, equitable, and in keeping with our ethics as Ismaili Muslims. Our topic for the session today is There is No God But God, Exploring the Nature of God, and we aim to engage in a discourse on God's nature as described in the Qur'an and how this discourse is foundational in Islam. During the session, you will see a Q&A box where you can share additional questions and thoughts during the presentation. We will try to address as many questions as we can. With that, I'm honored to introduce you to our wonderful speaker for today's session, Dr. Ali Asani. Dr. Asani, thank you for joining us. Dr. Ali Asani is a Murray Albertson Professor of Middle Eastern Studies and Professor of Indo-Muslim and Islamic Religion and Cultures at Harvard University. Dr. Asani was recently appointed to the Institute of Ismaili Studies Board of Governors, chairing the academic committee. A specialist of Islam in South Asia, he teaches a variety of courses related to Islam and Muslim cultures at Harvard, including multi-sensory religion, rethinking Islam through the arts, Qawwali, Sufiyana Kalam, and the Ginans, Muslim devotional literatures of South Asia. For several decades, he has been active in improving the understanding of Islam and its role in Muslim societies by conducting workshops for educators, as well as making presentations at various public forums. He has been involved in Islamic Cultural Studies Initiative, an international professional development program for high school teachers in Kenya, Pakistan, and USA, intended to promote a culturally and historically based approach to the study of Islam in Muslim societies. He has also served on the American Academy of Religion's task force at the teaching of religion in schools and as a consultant for the National Endowment for the Humanities Bridging Cultures Muslim Journeys Bookshelf Project. For his outstanding contributions in improving intercultural and race relations, he received the Harvard Foundation Medal and the Petra Shatak Prize for Excellence in Teaching by Harvard's Division of Continuing Education. In 2020, he was named the Harvard Foundation's Faculty of the Year for his efforts at making Harvard a more inclusive institution. At the outset, I'd like to note that the views of our speakers expressed during the course of this discussion are his own. Let's turn to the conversation then. Thank you, Dr. Asani, for joining us. We're privileged to have you.
Thank you for this invitation.
I'd like to begin our conversation today by drawing attention to the title of this session, There's No God But God, a statement that makes up the Muslim creed and is recited as the Shahada by Muslims multiple times in their daily prayers. A personal experience as a child, I recited the Shahada robotically, didn't quite understanding what it means. And even today, I find the phrase a little elusive and strange. So would you please explain the statement, there is no God but Allah? And I will add one more question to that. Would you also go into, the origin etymology of Allah, the Arabic term for God, and let us know how the description gives us clues into the concept of God in Islam.
Okay, so so this question that you've asked is is not something that can be easily answered because and I want to sort of quote paraphrase a passage from the Qur'an, that if all the trees were pens and all the oceans and 7 more oceans were ink, we still would not have enough to record or to talk about the nature of God. Because the subject itself is, you can look at that Quranic phrase, it's incomprehensible in a certain sense. It's so vast, it's so major. So, you're at a loss for words. So I want to sort of start with that. And it's interesting that when we talk about this term, there's no God but God, the Shahada, La ilaha illallah. Very often people translated it as there's no God except the God. And it's seen as an affirmation of the oneness of God. And we'll come back later to talk about Tawheed. But at this point, what I want to emphasize in here is that the first part of that phrase, there's no God, it's a negation. Mm. And that negation is followed by an affirmation. And so you think about what really is being negated and what are you affirming? And that negation part of it, there is no God, can be, of course, interpreted in many different ways. But the way that I think it makes most sense is that you're negating everything other than the one God. So, let's say God with a capital G, and I'm going to come back to this term God itself. So one way in which people have understood it is that what's being negated there is your ego. Because the person who's reciting it is actually saying, it's a way of saying, I'm going to go from being egocentric and self-centered to God-centered. Mm-hmm. And that's an interesting way when you think about the term Islam is submission. So when the first thing that you're saying is that there's something mightier than me. I'm negating my ego because there is only one ego. So this idea of this negation and affirmation becomes very important. And in the Arabic, when you write this La ilaha, the first word that you write La, it is almost, if you see it in the script, it's almost shaped like a scissor. And so some poets actually use that to say, well, this La, which is shaped like a scissor, is actually the scissor by which you cut off your ego. And it starts this very phrase. So, that's an interesting way of trying to think about this, that we are always talking about it, but what does it, practically mean? So going to this notion of God, the word God that we're using, it's a human construction. And, it has a history, and we don't have time to go into that history. But I would say it's a label of convenience that humans have created, and now, of course, it's created in English, that humans have created to talk about something, a notion of something that transcends the human. So it's this label of, but it's a label that is totally, we try to, express it in human terms, but actually what you're trying to convey is actually cannot be totally understood from a human perspective. So for instance, if you take the Arabic word for God, Allah, that word, if you go if you look at the etymology of that word in Arabic, one way to think about it is that the root is A-L-H, because all these Arabic words have a triconsonant. And this word, this root, A-L-H, has the sense of bewilderment, confusion, that you're really talking about, and something that is so perplexing and so confusing because it transcends human reason. And so some people have said that it's actually a very, interesting that the word Allah comes, the root of it is actually, bewilderment, confusion, loss of words. That why are we, that it's something that transcends language. And so, we have this famous quote from Ibn Arabi, where he sort of talks, increase my perplexity of you. But, so God is something that is very perplexing, confusing, bewildering. And no matter how hard you try to understand the nature of God, it's an ongoing process, because it's sort of the more layers and the more complex it becomes. So we're dealing with something ultimately that human beings cannot really understand. And there's an interesting verse in the Qur'an, which I want to also point out here. And some of you know this verse, the light verse, where it's trying to explain, it's using the example of light. And of course, this is just a metaphor that is being used, but it's saying God is like the light of the heavens and the earth. And it's trying to explain that this light is like a niche within it is a lamp, and the lamp within a glass. But you can see it's got all these metaphors in about olive oil and trees that have neither of the east nor the west, and light upon light. But the use of this light, the symbol of light, and that God's this thing that God, the essence of God, is connected with light. Now, light can mean many different things, but it's light that guides you from darkness of ignorance to the light of knowledge. But also, light is something that you have to experience, because light is connected with seeing. And so what this is actually saying here is that this light is, when you think about God as light and that seeing God, it's talking about experience. So God is something that we can talk about intellectually, and constantly being perplexed by that. But ultimately, it's pointing to the fact that God is an experience. It's not a thing, it's something that you experience. So there's an experiential aspect of this, and light and seeing go together. And then this verse, of course, is also very interesting, because it also talks about, this light is like a lamp, it's like a niche in which there's a lamp. And through this lamp, we are receiving this light. And that verse, this idea of light, again, this is very important in Shi and Sufi and even general Islamic sort of notions of who is this, what are these lamps through which we receive this light. And so you can talk about prophets, you can talk about the imams, you can talk about the Sufi sheikh. There have been different meanings to this. So that there's this sense of God as light, and as a form of guidance, but also as a form of experience. Can you experience this light? It's inviting you to experience this light, and through that light, getting knowledge of everything. So, I think that's, I think it shows you the complexity of even trying to think about this subject, God or Allah. And I should mention here that this word Allah in Arabic doesn't mean a Muslim God. It's very important because sometimes people think that, when we use the word Allah in Arabic, and, we mean a different God. It's actually not. So Arabs, Christians, use the same word to talk about God. And the reason in this session, we'll be switching back and forth between Allah and God, but we're really talking about something, you go beyond the literal meaning, that it's something that is universal. Right. In the Quran, it's very clear that this Allah is not something that's specifically Muslim. He's the God of everything, all of creation. Yeah, so there's a universalness in this.
I'm intrigued by what you just said. Allah is impossible to understand. Divine is so huge. Yet, of course, we frequently use speech in an attempt to define God. And one such definition that you alluded to as well forms a core principle for all monotheistic faiths, is the concept of one God, understood as Tawheed in Islam. Would you please help us understand how Tawheed can be interpreted? And to what extent is it similar or different to the Judeo-Christian understanding of one God? Because, I looked at the chat, and, there is a little bit of a query there that, is it, you just explained that, yes, Allah is the same God, it's the same, it's interchangeable in that way. So it will be good to understand what is this idea of one God, and is it a similar idea that we share?
Yeah, yeah. So I think that there is this, so generally speaking, when people talk about Tawheed, people say, okay, it comes from the word Wahid, which means one, and people are thinking one in terms of number, right? And certainly that's one way people have interpreted that this is a numerical, that there's only one God. But I think that, behind this notion of one, it's not so much, we can certainly interpret it that way, but it also is talking about oneness, unicity. And in a way, it's pointing, it's connected with this idea of this God as being something that is pre-eternal, that is the only thing that's real. And so even though I think, for example, Christians talk about the Trinity, but underlying even that notion is that there's only one thing that is eternal, that is real, and that actually unifies, that you can see the essence everywhere. So there's a kind of, in the Islamic case, there's only one reality. There's only one thing that actually exists, that is eternal. There's this Quranic phrase that everything perishes except the face of God. And so we can see that there is a sense that at the end of it all, there's only one reality. We have a sense that we have our own individual realities, but everything perishes, it's transitory, and so on. So it's talking about this oneness in the sense that ultimately there's only one thing that's going to be eternal. And that's why we talk very often, with this, again, this Quranic phrase, inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. This phrase is actually, of course, often recited when we hear somebody has passed away. But this idea is that there's only one source. We come from that source, and we are going to return to that source. And that source is that ultimate reality. So this idea of everything having an origin in God, in this one reality, however we want to phrase it, and then coming into this world and getting a sense of separateness, that it's separate, and getting a sense of being individual, but not realizing that its source, where it comes from, is actually the only thing that's real. And this recognition of returning to that source becomes very important. And one particular Quranic phrase, Quranic expression I want to share with you here this idea of this return is this verse from the Quran, and I want to focus on this, particularly this language of that's talking about primordial, that before creation actually took place. This Quranic verse is saying it's talking about that before creation actually took place, God said, "Am I not your Lord?" In Arabic, "Alastu bi rabbikum." And this uncreated creation responded by saying, "Bala shahidna." Yes, we witness it. And that acknowledgement by saying, yes, we witness it, poets and theologians say existence came into being. So existence comes into being in response to God's call, "Am I not your Lord?" And when it says, and all of existence, not just the humans, it's seen as everything, the flowers, the plants, everything jumps into existence in response to this call. And when you have this act of creation, everything is united with God, because everything is one with God and in the presence of God at this moment of creation. And so it's this primordial moment of perfection, of union, of oneness with God. So another way of thinking about Tawheed, right? Everybody is one in the presence of God. And this is very often seen, interpreted also as a time when a covenant of love is established between God and all of creation. That by saying, "Bala shahidna," yes, we witness it, all of creation is not only just acknowledging obedience of God, that you are, but it's also seen as pledging their love for God. So it's seen as this covenant of love. And so love is this kind of this cosmic force that unites everything in creation with God. So there's a pact of love between God and the rest of the creation. And this love is seen, at least in esoteric interpretations of Islam, as a cosmic transformative force that's present, and the spark of it is in every creature. But the problem is that with creation, people have forgotten that spark of love. And so this is why part of the journey of transformation, the journey of submission, is reawakening this spark of love. So ultimately, it is saying that that we all come from the same source. We all come from the same soul, if you will, the one universal soul, if you want to put it. And there, of course, we have this very interesting use of this Quranic verse from Surah 4 that was part of the, if you will, the motto, the logo for the Golden Jubilee is that, be careful of your duty to your Lord who created you from a single soul. And this idea that everything that has been created comes from one soul. We may think about differences of species and, in different material forms, but we have, beyond all these physical forms that we see, this multiplicity of forms that we see it all comes from the one soul. But we get so caught up in seeing the multiplicity that we fail to see the soul, the one reality, if you will, the oneness, the Tawheed that lies beyond it. Because we are just seeing with the physical eye. They say if you saw with the heart and you saw the inner reality, you would recognize this oneness. And so part of it is, so when you see the other, whoever the other is, are you recognizing that in that other, there is also the soul, that one soul? So for instance, I think you started with this land acknowledgement. And I think it's very important, this land acknowledgement where you're talking about, you're seeing the other and you're recognizing that you are connected to the other because we all come from the same soul, right? Um, and of course, this idea is that we've forgotten this connection. So, one of the words for the Quran calls itself dhikr. Dhikr meaning a reminder, reminding you of what you've forgotten. And so that's another very important part of this tawheed, that we've forgotten this oneness. And the whole message of the Quran is to remind us of, the unicity, the oneness of creation and how we are connected to everything else.
Thank you for sharing that. I think it's a beautiful way to understand God through connectedness of everything. I'd like to look at some direct references from the Quran and get your thoughts on how we can better understand this relationship between God and all the creation through these verses. So starting with, the verse about that, I think you mentioned it a little bit as well. Everywhere you turn is the face of God. How do we begin to interpret this idea?
Yeah. So again, this idea, when people think about the face of God, what does the face of God mean? Right? It's using an anthropomorphic term, like, in the Quran, the hand of God and the face of God and so on. But it's very clear that it actually has and this verse in the Quran that, wherever you turn, you will perceive the face of God. And it's going back to the same reality that in nature, in the world that surrounds you, are the signs of God. And this has inspired, for example, the Persian poet Sa'di to talk about that every leaf of the tree becomes a page of sacred scripture when the soul has learned to read. Now, it's an interesting idea because the Quran talks about the signs of God are in nature. You're surrounded by the signs of God. And the signs of God, the word for signs in Arabic is ayat. And the same word that we use for verses for the Quran, we say ayat, the verses of the Quran. So we talk about ayat, the signs of God. So we, in a certain way, nature is a form of scripture. There is if you think about Quran as scripture, but actually the Quran is referring to a broader scripture that's around us. And can we read and connect to nature? And that, so we learn about God, not just through the explicit scripture, but there's an implicit scripture that surrounds us. And in that implicit scripture, there are the signs of God. And we can use those signs of God to better understand God, but also better understand ourselves. And it goes back again to this idea of knowledge and reading. Can we read nature with the right lens? Can we read the inner meanings of things? So this verse, for example, talks about every leaf is a scripture. And can we read that scripture? And this theme continues in the Quran. So there is another Quranic verse which is associated, that I think I wanted to say, that's connected with bees, and talking about that even creatures like bees, which God has created, are signs for people to ponder the way they organize them. They organize themselves as communities. They produce this wonderful drink, honey, which has, people say, curative qualities. But this is all the work of God. That God, this, whatever we want to call this, is creatively engaged in everything around us. So there's a kind of this creative orderliness that we see around us is actually one of the signs of God. This is just one example from the Quran, but we have other verses, and so there's a second verse that talks, these two other verses that I picked. There's no animal in the earth, nor a bird that flies on its two wings, but they're communities like yourselves. It's telling you that you're not the only God's creature. You're not the only creatures of God on earth. You're surrounded by other creatures, and they are communities like yourself. And they have their own world. And not only that, but you can say that, you see that that God, that every creature has its own way of praising God, so that each creature knows its prayer, and each creature glorifies God with its particular form of prayer. So this idea is that we're living in these parallel, communities, and we are totally ignorant what's happening in this. So there will be the sign that if you're able to see reality, if you're really able to experience unicity, Tawheed, and you see with the heart, you have that insight to be able to see all of this, you appreciate, the divine in a way that that says every way you turn is the face of God. And so it becomes also a different way in not only how you relate to other human beings, but how you're relating to other creatures as well. And the other sort of point that actually I want to bring up here is that, so there's a sense that, we're surrounded, by this reality, this one reality that we cannot recognize, we refuse to recognize, or we don't have the tools to recognize. But we are surrounded by this one reality that we sometimes just call God, and we see the signs, the active signs of it. But there's a very famous hadith, it's called the Hadith Qudsi, which says interestingly that neither my earth nor my heavens can contain me, but the heart of the believing servant contains me. That this reality that's out there is actually also within you, in your heart. But so there's this recognition that it's also something that's internal, not just something that is external. And that reality is contained within each creature that recognizes its position vis-a-vis the Creator.
The significance of nature as God's signs, and in your words, God's implicit scripture, is so profound, especially, commonly we don't think of monotheistic faiths as natural religions. So I feel like this idea makes God accessible to a certain extent. And I want to continue our conversation about this relationship with God that we are trying to make consistently. And a common practice amongst Muslims is to lean on what we call Asma al-Husna, these beautiful names of God. How does I would like to know the origin as well, but I also want to know how attributes and names help us understand God's nature.
Yeah, thank you for that question. What you're referring to, this Asma al-Husna, the beautiful names of God, these are derived from the Quran. So in the Quran, it's interesting because it's saying, how do you possibly understand this, this experience of something that, transcends language, transcends reason? And so you have these attributes in the Quran, and these attributes are divided into what are called the names of majesty, of grandeur, but also the names of beauty, Jalal and Jamal. This name, and these names of beauty and majesty and beauty are interesting because on the one hand, they are talking about, they're using human, let's say these attributes are humanly constructed attributes. Really, you're using human language. So through human language, you're trying to capture some aspect of this divine, but what is interesting about the language that you're using is a language of contradiction. So you will see in these names of majesty and beauty, there is this, what the Christian theologian Rudolf Otto talks about it, because you have this in the Christian tradition, is the the names of awe and grandeur, what he calls mysterium tremendum, that scares, that's something that creates awe. But on the other hand, there's a mysterium fascinans, something that attracts you. And those are the names of beauty. So you have this, dual kind of experience. It's something that looks so transcendent, but at the same time, it feels so familiar. And so you think about, how can this be? And that contradiction in there is a way in trying to talk about that really, even though we may put these terms and these attributes, assign these terms and attributes to what we are calling God, Allah, and remember again, in the term itself, you're saying something that we cannot totally understand. And that's beyond all these attributes, but we're using these attributes as a kind of convenience for us to try to capture the complexity. They're actually saying that, even though we're using human language and we're using these terms, but there's an ultimate contradiction in there, that is actually telling, well, yeah, you're using this, but you cannot really understand it. But very often these names, this Asmaul Husna, are recited. And they become an important way in which one remembers God, because, if there's a sense that human beings have forgotten God, the God that surrounds them and so on, how do you remember something? You remember something by its name. You need a name to remember something, because if you don't have a name, you can't remember it. So these names of beauty become ways in which we not only remember, but we also experience. So I think at this point, we just want to share a short video on this, of this recitation of these names of God.
يا من هو الله الذي لا إله إلا هو الرحمن الرحيم الملك القدوس السلام المؤمن المهيمن العزيز الجبار المتكبر الخالق البارئ المصور الغفار القهار الوهاب الرزاق الفتاح العليم القابض الباسط الخافض الرافع المعز المذل السميع البصير الحكم العدل اللطيف الخبير الحليم العظيم الغفور الشكور العليم الكبير الحفيظ المقيم الحسيب الجليل الكريم الرقيب المجيب الواسع الحكيم الودود المجيد الباعث الشهيد الحق المكين القوي المتين الولي الحميد المحسن المبدي المعين المحيي المميت الحي القيوم الواجد الماجد الواحد الصمد القادر المقتدر المقدم المؤخر الأول الآخر الظاهر الباطن الوالي المتعال البر التواب المنتقم العفو الرؤوف مالك الملك ذو المقسط الجامي الغني المغني الماني الظاهر النافي النور الهادي البديع الباقي الوارث الرشيد الصبور.
Okay, and I think what is interesting about that video is, of course, these names of God is a form of remembrance of God. But, it's not just through the sound, the sound arts and so on, that we can experience the divine, because it's a way of contemplation. And interestingly, very often, they say in this Asmaul Husna, you have the Isme Azam, the greatest of the names. And it's in esoteric traditions of Islam, you usually initiated into practice of meditation on the nature of God through what's, an Isme Azam. So this is a, interesting way in how these Quranic words, the Quranic terms actually become part of personal meditation. So these are two images that you're seeing here of the words, the Asmaul Husna. And they're done by an Iraqi artist. And if you see, the one, I guess that's on the left-hand side, you see this Asmaul Husna, the motion is inward. And so you see this Asmaul Husna taking you inwards towards the infinity. So you see that light over there. So it's guiding you to that which is beyond form, beyond anything, this idea of light. But so it's the material, you're transcending the material and getting into the spiritual. And the one on the right is actually the reverse movement. It's what is infinite is actually coming into the material existence. And so you see it, the circle there is that there is this kind of, what seems chaotic, it seems disturbed, but then it comes out and then you start seeing the shapes and you start seeing the forms. So in a certain way, this universal that is beyond description, beyond comprehension, becomes manifest in this world through forms and shapes. So this is a very interesting set of calligraphies that are again showing about how we can think about the arts as ways in which we can even engage with our faith. But this idea of the beautiful names of God, and it connects with the idea of the beauty of God, that God is very often seen as beauty, and so God is beautiful and loves beauty, and you get a sense of it through the calligraphy, you get a sense through that recitation, but ultimately the idea of the beauty of God is represented through the Qur'an itself. So the Qur'an, as people know, was revealed as an oral text. It was not written down. It got written down much later after the Prophet died. But during the time of the Prophet, the Quran actually functioned as an oral text. And the beauty of the text itself, the recitation, the words, the poetic nature of the aesthetics of the text was seen as actually a sign of its divine origin. When people would say to the Prophet, how do we know this, what you're saying is revealed to you by the one God? How do we know there's something sacred behind this? And the answer is, that comes from the Quran. You create something as beautiful as this. You will not be able to. And so it becomes a kind of a challenge. So because of that, I think what you see in the Quran is what I call a theopoetic text. That is a text that is filled with aesthetics, the recitation of it, is to be marked by beauty, and it's really the beauty of the text that converted people. So if you look at conversion stories, at least internal Muslim narratives about why did people follow the Prophet, they said, well, what he was reciting was so beautiful that people would weep and cry. How could you resist such a text? So we have the story of, the Caliph Omar's whole connection, conversion, quote unquote conversion moment was after he heard a Quranic text. It was so beautiful that he simply could not, resist the tradition. So that beauty lies at the heart of this text. But if you look at the Quranic message, so on the one hand, there's the beauty and the aesthetics of the recitation, but within that aesthetics is embedded the moral, the ethical, the spiritual, the philosophical, and so on, so that we see that the way this is being transmitted is through the aesthetic, the beauty. So beauty and these different aspects become one. That's why I would say that this Quran is a theopoetic text. So when you listen to the Quran, you're simultaneously engaging with the aesthetics and the ethical and the moral and the physical, all in. So it's everything is combined as one. We will let's listen to a recitation of the Quran, of Quranic verse that illustrates this.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والضحى والليل إذا سجى ما ودعك ربك وما قلى وللآخرة خير لك من الأولى ولسوف يعطيك ربك فترضى ألم يجدك يتيما فآوى ووجدك ضالا فهدى ووجدك عائلا فأغنى فأما اليتيم فلا تقهر فأما اليتيم فلا تقهر وأما السائل فلا تنهر وأما بنعمة ربك فحدث بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ألم نشرح لك صدرك
All right. So this piece was actually very interesting because you can see just the beauty of the recitation and this amazing recitation, which, when I've played it, sometimes people say, oh, you feel goosebumps and you can feel it. And there's actually a Quranic verse that actually talks about that the Quran, when you hear the Quran, it will cause your skin to shiver and your heart to melt. This is part of the Quranic, I would say the beautiful magic of the Quran as a recited text. But if you look at this text itself, this was a time when the Prophet was going through a very difficult time. He was depressed, he felt despondent, he felt abandoned, and then he gets this revelation from God trying to console him that no, you are not abandoned, and after this difficult time will come a better time, and that your Lord is there to look after you, and did he not find you as an orphan? did he not find you poor and made you rich, and so on. And then it ends with this very interesting sort of call that be careful how you treat the orphan, those who don't have anybody to speak for them, to look after them, and repulse not the beggar. So it's tied into this one's ethical and moral duty to the powerless and helping those in need. So in this particular verse, you have this combination of different elements in it. And this verse is actually very popular amongst at the level of ordinary people when they feel depressed and so on. They turn to this verse in the Quran as a consolation for themselves, that just as it was a consolation for the Prophet. So this again is this notion of the beauty of God.
Yeah.
And that it's manifest through the text itself. And it is sort of said that the ultimate sort of reward for in the Quran, the ultimate reward for the believer is facing the people's face, people who's resplendent, by looking at the Lord, like seeing God, this idea of experiencing God that brings you peace and calm and resplendence. So that again is this notion that the ultimate reward, what we are looking for, what we're seeking, is getting that vision, that experience of God. And of course, that experience of God is very central in Islam, all forms, because as we know, the Prophet's journey on the Miraj, that's what it is about. It's his journey to see that resplendent face of God. And again, face, I would put in quotation marks, right? To experience the light.
Right. This is so amazing, Dr. Asani. You're true to your word in creating a beautiful experience for us too as we talk about God. And the images that you have shared in the videos are just so captivating. A quick note to the audience, since many are inquiring if this video of our conversation today is available to them, there is a link that will be shared at the end. So yes, the recording is available. Back to you, Dr. Asani, since we've been talking about naming conventions, I have a quick insert, a common question that comes to mind in terms of how we address God, right? And commonly it's been done in terms of using male pronouns. And we know that God does not have a physical form or gender. Do you find a change in Muslim practice in terms of the pronouns that are being used for God?
Yeah, I think, people have always recognized, through centuries, that even when you talk about he, God as he, that, you're using human language, which is gender. But, what is interesting in the Quran is that, because the Quran, when there are verses where God speaks, as it were, right, it's always referred to as we. And we have vested the knowledge of anything. It's always using the plural. Never, and that use of the plural is interesting, because some people think, oh, well, how does this conflict with Tawheed? But it's not a conflict with Tawheed, because they're using the plural to indicate status. So God is supreme, so you use the we, the royal we, if you will. But in some languages, for example, with Urdu, for example, when we want to be respectful to somebody, even though you have this word like wo, he or she, we sometimes refer to them as they. We use the plural forms. So say, so you use wo in its plural sense. So you don't say, for example, in Urdu, people say uska naam, his name. But if you want to be polite, you say unka naam, their name. And it's a way of showing politeness and respect. So this idea of using the plural, is a way, that some people are translating the Quran now as referring they. And it interestingly, it mirrors, some of the things that you're seeing in American culture, where people are identifying as they. But again, it's an acknowledgement that these human pronouns that we're using, he, she, they, it, they're all confining. And we have to remember that, while we're using this, we don't fall into the trap of thinking God through those, because these are just human categories that we are projecting onto God. But there's a recognition in the text that God transcends all these labels. That's why it's very confusing. You can't, any label you put in will not be sufficient, will be inadequate. So I think that's something very important to keep in mind about, the use of gendered language to refer something that's beyond gender, beyond human conception, right? So.
Right. I'm going to pivot a little bit and go back to, the concept that you had mentioned earlier, the idea of submission. What does it mean to submit to God, considering submission is at the heart of Islam, its literal meaning? What kind of transformation can occur through submission?
Yeah. So I would say, there are three important concepts that we need to look at here. One is, of course, the word Islam itself. And Islam, we usually think about it in the name of a religion, but we know it means actually submission. And I said submission, some people connect submission with obedience, but I think it's much more than that. It's commitment. So it's commitment to the one God, right? Commitment. So it implies a sense of commitment. And then there's Iman, which is faith. So, and then there's this other word, ihsan. And this term, ihsan, is an interesting term because it is said that, some people, define Islam, ihsan, as, being conscious that there is God. Being conscious that God sees you even though you don't see God, so that you are always in the presence of God. And ihsan is, being aware of that state. But my own interpretation of this is this word ihsan, that's I-H-S-A-N, comes from the root for beauty, hasan. So husn, we have it in husna, asmal husna. That same root, HSN, is in this word ihsan. So it actually comes from this word for beauty. And I interpret this is that, you have Islam, Iman, and then ihsan would literally mean becoming beautiful. So there's a state of transformation and you become beautiful. And what does it mean to become beautiful? Somebody who becomes beautiful by mirroring the attributes of God. The process of transformation where you replace the negative virtues the negative qualities with beautiful virtues, and the beautiful virtues that mirror the attributes of God. So if you are talking about God as forgiveness, and you're seeking forgiveness of God, are you yourself a mirror of that forgiveness to other people? How, if you're talking about God as almighty and merciful, are you being merciful to others? So how do you become a mirror, a beautiful person that mirrors these attributes in how you relate to to the world around you, not just other humans, but also this idea that's in the Quran about being Khalifa, a representative, that God created the human as the Khalifa, the vicegerent, the representative of God on earth. That means we have this trust for as God's representatives on earth for everything, for creation, the environment, all these kinds of things. So this idea of becoming a beautiful person is that this act of submission should lead to a transformation of the self. And that transformation of the self renders, at the end of it, you become a person who reflects like a mirror the beauty of God. So, and that ultimately, that you've gone from being egocentric to God-centric. So I would say in summary, that's really the notion.
Well, we are on top of the hour, but I want to sneak in one final question that may even lead you to, share some of your closing thoughts that we will appreciate. What is the notion behind the concept of God guiding us to, the term we use, Sirat al-Mustaqim? Is there really a right path, and how do we conceive of this right path through actions and behaviors?
Yeah. So it's an interesting sort of question because when we think about Sirat al-Mustaqim, we think about a path, a road. And this road, we think about it in a single dimension, right? That it's, in a physical sense, you say, okay, I'm going down this path, I'm going down this road, and you see it in a single dimension. But when you look at the Quran, the way in which the Quran defines the path of righteousness is the correct path. There's this very important Quranic verse which talks about that defining righteousness, and that righteousness is not just about turning your face east and west, about engaging in ritual prayer, but righteousness is about belief, and belief in one God, the last day, the angels, and the book. And the book, it doesn't refer to the Quran specifically. It is the book of God, which is manifest through many scriptures. So that's why we talk about Ahlul Kitab, because they've all received message, revelation from the same book. So that book is that heavenly book of God's guidance. And the prophets, all the prophets, it doesn't say specifically Prophet Muhammad. So again, there's that inclusiveness. So somebody who's righteous has this belief, but if you look at the rest of it, it is about social action, addressing the needs of people. So you have the, giving wealth to the near of kin, the orphans, the needy, the traveler, and then embedded in there is perform the prayer. And the prayer, salat, is very loosely defined in the Quran, and then gives the zakat. And the zakat, again, is meant to be used for the poor, the sick, the needy. And then it talks about one's qualities of patience and being truthful and sincere and so on. So we have here this idea that, in fact, that being on the Sirat al-Mustaqim is not just prayer. It involves social action. So we talk about that it's not just ibadah, it's how you're actually connecting with the society around you and how you're addressing the needs of the poor, the sick, and so on. And there are many Quranic verses that actually talk about people who pray just to be seen by other people are actually hypocrites. That engagement with faith necessarily means engagement with issues of social justice and making equity, social equity in society. So let's listen to one of these Quranic verses. Yeah.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم أرأيت الذي يكذب بالدين فذلك الذي يدع اليتيم ولا يحض على طعام المسكين فويل للمصلين الذين هم عن صلاتهم ساهون الذين هم يراءون ويمنعون الماعون.
All right. So that again was a Quranic verse that beautifully encompasses that notion of social action. So I think maybe we should open up for questions and reflection. I did want to say that somebody asked this question about, is the word Allah without gender? Absolutely. It is understood as genderless, but when we translate it, we say we're using human language. So it is supposed to be, the concept, transcends gender, but we tend to then, humans as they are tend to interpret it within a patriarchal structure, or otherwise by you assigning humanly constructed notions of gender and so on.
Mhm. Thank you. Thank you so much for those reflective thoughts, Dr. Asani. Before we go to the audience questions, I just wanted to echo some audience feedback when I say that this has been a really profound experience and enriching learning. You've shared some powerful ideas, and a couple that I particularly cherish include this idea of the transcendence of God, that God is always greater than you can conceive. And I think today you've led me to think that there is joy in recognizing how limited our minds are and how little we know about ourselves and others, let alone God. And secondly, I also wanted to appreciate the fact that you've energized our understanding of Tawheed, that isn't really the idea of God is one and I'm second, but not just a mere numerical definition, but it speaks to the unity of us as a creation. So I will attempt to take this sanctity of knowledge of connectedness and when I interact with others, and a true heartfelt thank you for sharing your wisdom. As we go through the questions, Dr. Sani, let's start with, again, this conversation about the unity of being. There's a question here that asks, can you comment on Ibn al-Arabi's unity of being, Wahdatul Wujud, and Ibn Sina's radical unity, perhaps in relation to eminence and transcendence?
Yeah, so I would say, these are, they're really trying to talk about the same thing, but using different language, at least the way I understand it. And this is my interpretation, and other people may have different interpretations. But I think this notion of Ibn Arabi's Wahdatul Wujud, and he actually very often this is attributed to him, but we know that actually this idea of unity of existence is really in the Qur'an itself. So it's not something that he invented. That it's a notion, this idea that everything comes from one soul. That's a Quranic idea, and people have tended to associate this Wahdatul Wujud with Ibn Arabi because he's expressed this philosophically. But I would say that this notion itself of I think with the Ibn Sina, I'm trying to refresh my memory about Ibn Sina, but this idea of transcendence and immanence, that something that can transcend, but is at the same time be so close. That in itself is part of that contradictory nature, that contradiction, that you understand God through contradiction. And it's a way, I would say, it's also pointing to something that, this phrase that we talk about, Allahu Akbar, which we tend to translate as God is great, but actually Akbar means greater. And so we are saying God is greater. Greater than what? Anything you can imagine. So even these attempts that you get from a philosophical perspective and so on, that are trying to capture the nature of God, that this is part of the perplexity of trying to understand, and different people have tried different frameworks to understand about God. But I think what I was trying to emphasize in this presentation, that while we can use the intellect to think about and contemplate the nature of God and use different tools like philosophy and theology and mysticism and so on, but ultimately what lies at the heart of this is experience. And that once you've had that experience, it transcends anything. There's a difference between knowing about God, and there can be different formulations of knowing about God, as opposed to be knowing God, experiencing God. And really in the Quran, it's what at the heart of this is, that it's the heart of the tradition is experiencing God, seeing the face of God, that light. So I would sort of come back to that notion, yeah.
In the same vein, I think another question is, could you touch upon Imam Sultan Muhammad Shah's articulation of God as Islam is, in terms of monoreality, and how does this relate to historic and contemporary Ismaili Neoplatonic ideas?
Well, I mean, these Neoplatonic ideas, that we have the universal intellect and universal soul, I don't think we find it clearly articulated in modern, like if you look at our modern articulation of Ismaili thought, you have glimmers, this idea of a journey of this from the universal soul, this journey back to the universal soul. That's also a Sufi idea, right? So, the idea of the journey, and I may sort of mentioned it before, but it's talking about this journey of transformation and perfection. So even if you look at Neoplatonic thought, that's what it is about. And we can, there are people, as we know, who think about these matters in a Neoplatonic framework, and that's fine. You can talk about the multiple ways in which one can articulate the same notion. It's what people feel comfortable with. That you can talk about God in many, many different forms, in many, many different. So Neoplatonism is one way in which people have talked about the nature of God, that's not just Islamic, but has, roots in philosophy, broader philosophical traditions. But Muslims have, used that framework, and Ismailis have used that framework, but we've also used Sufi frameworks. And, in some cases, they've been legalistic frameworks. So we have tried to understand all of this through different frameworks. I think that's what's important to remember.
This is an interesting question. What is the role of the Ismaili Imam in leading us to the experience of God that you mentioned?
So that actually is something that, if you look at the current articulations of the imamate that you find in the Ismaili constitution, it talks about that the primary role of the imam is to use, this talim and tawil to guide the murid to the light, to a state of spiritual enlightenment. And then also, and improve the quality of the life of murids. So in there, you see very clearly articulated that there is this notion of the guide to the light, that the role is somebody who guides you to the light and to a state of enlightenment. And second is this improving the quality of life. So these notions of light and are really at the core of even contemporary notions of being Ismaili as they are being articulated within the constitution.
I'm going to pick up on the conversation we were having about the attributes of God. It's a two-part question. So, there's a question about the contradictions that we find in the names of God as well. So first of all, how do we understand names such as God, the destroyer, at the same time as God is a merciful, and how do we engage with that? And secondly, something our secondary step students really struggle with, and adults as well, is how to reconcile these different sides of God. So God being merciful, but then there are, realities of the world with, children dying and, negative effects on climate change and acts of God. Would love to hear your perspective on that.
Well, I think some of it is very interesting because if you think about notions, people think, why are there bad things happening in the world? Or why is there evil in the world? And somehow people think that God is involved in there. And this is I think it's a very, difficult notion because people tend to think about God that God creates evil. And we don't have the time to deconstruct that, but I would argue that God is not involved in all of this. There's other frameworks we can think about. So that framework of thinking about God has created evil and God has created pain and so on, has affected how people think about the nature of God. But hopefully that can be, as I said, we don't have the time really to, but I would actually dispute that way of thinking about God. I would also like to say that, you know, because again, based on one of these chats that we got, so what about science? Well, the study of nature and creation, science is in fact a way of discovering God. And it's very clear in the Quran that if you want to know God through the creation. And that you see the complexity of nature, the complexity of systems, of living systems, whether they are of plants or animals or the human, that in all of this is a sign of God. And this is why they would say that indeed, you know, people talk about there's a conflict between science and religion, but not from a Quranic perspective, that scientific endeavor is actually meant to enable people to better appreciate the nature of creation and also and help them reflect on the ultimate cause that may have created this. Like, you know, what has created this complexity, collective, creative orderliness that we see around us. And, you know, scientists like Einstein and so on have said that if you need, they're absolutely convinced that by all their studying science and discovering all this, you know, this order down to the microcosm, that there has to be a great mind behind this. It can't just be just random. So that's another whole way of then also thinking about, you know, science and religion, as it's commonly thought about that there's a conflict, but actually, you know, from this perspective, there isn't a conflict.
Right. Coming back quickly to the, you know, the dual experience that we find in the attributes, how does one reconcile with some of those?
You actually can't reconcile, because when you're trying to reconcile, you're trying to rationalize. And the fact is that you can't rationalize anything about God, because you're trying through the process of rationalizing. How can something be this and that? How can it be the opposite? Well, the whole point of it is that it is, and you will never comprehend it. So the idea is, it's not to get you not to be fixed with one way of thinking about God. That's why you have the contradiction. And there's you know, tons of scholarship written about this idea of this theology of contradiction, of this, what they would say a negative, it's not this, it's not this, it's not this, that you find in Hindu philosophical thought, in Christian thought, and so on, that it's basically not to make you too comfortable in one way of thinking about God.
That's wonderful. I think that could be the question that we end on. Our apologies if we haven't been able to address everyone's questions. We've tried our best. There's been a very, very large number of questions that have been coming, and I think it's a response in its own way to what Dr. Asani has offered us today. So thank you again, Dr. Asani. It's been a pleasure and privilege. Thank you, audience, for joining us today. Hopefully this is just the start of the critical conversation. Today was you know, quite wonderful to, you know, begin this journey again. A couple of announcements before you go. In the chat, you will find resources that are recommended by our speaker. There's one on the Vision of Islam by William Chittick and The History of God by Karen Armstrong. For the recording of this conversation, as many of you have asked, and past conversations, please visit the Facets of Faith page on the .Ismaili USA. I think the link appears in the chat as well. Please look out for more information on the .Ismaili USA page and social media pages for young adult conversations this week and our upcoming, the next critical conversation. And finally, please take the survey at the end of the session that will pop out on your screen as you leave. Thank you, everyone, and Yali Madad. Happy Sunday.